So we are going to talk about reactive state with NGRX store. So what we're going to do is take the concepts that we've covered up to this point and start to weave them into something concrete that we can use, and hopefully you can take these concepts and start to apply them to your projects at work and at home for fun and for profit. So we're going to talk about Redux as it relates to NGRX store. Then we'll talk about the store, reducers, and actions. And so really, for the most part, that's all it is. And then we'll talk about store select and store.dispatch. And if you have been mildly paying attention today, you have actually seen a lot of these things already. So I feel like we're dealing with a hot observable at this point. So RxJS, NGRX store is just an RxJS powered state management solution for Angular 2. And it was very much inspired by Redux. It's slightly different because it uses RxJS. I'm going to skip this slide. And yes, so the store is essentially the database, and it allows all state manipulation on the store happens in the reducers, and it takes the reducer, and from that it provides an observable to be consumed within the components. Stores can also perform pre-reducer and post-reducer operations via middleware. I think that this particular feature of NGRX store is still, it needs to mature just a bit. And I was talking to Rob, I hope he doesn't get mad at me for quoting this, is that he feels like in a lot of cases just using a service to handle some of these things, like how we saw that we have a service that's handling the asynchronous stuff and then handing it off to the store, is an adequate solution. So single state tree, again, we have the store, which then feeds off state to service and component. And what this looks like is really just think of your data schema for your entire application. So in the case of the sample application, we have an app store. So this is just an interface that I've defined. And we have an array of items. And we have a selected item. And so now when I pass this store in, I'm saying here's the store, but it is of a type. So I'll call it store, but I'll say store, but then I'll type it to this app store. Let me just show you what that looks like real quick. So if we go to, so you see here, I'm injecting store into my items component, and I'm saying take the store service, and it is typed to this app store object. And so now just think of this as here's your database and here's the schema for this. Any questions on that?
Is App Store imported then?
Yes.
Upstairs?
So if we go up here. And so what I do just by convention, and there's a few different ways that you can actually organize your file system. Scott was actually telling me a better way to do this would have been to call the stores folder reducers. And so I may actually refactor that when I'm not in the middle of a workshop. But I have put all my interfaces into the models. So it just simply is defined the shape of the data models that we're working with. So App Store, in this case, is this. And so this just allows you to indicate to your application as you're passing it around, this is what the entire data model for this application looks like. Question?
The question on, is it best to try to use a single store for each application or with nested data, or would you have multiple stores?
So you will only use one store, but then you will interact with subtrees of that via a reducer. And so it's best practice to keep those separated. So if you actually start to look at like deeply nested data, Dan Abramoff talks about this quite a bit at length, that it's really hard, especially when you're doing immutable operations, to modify a sub piece of like nested data. It gets really complicated to work with. So he created a library called Normalizer, which will actually go through a nested data structure and flatten it out with IDs. And so if you're interested in kind of seeing his thoughts on that, go check out the Normalizer project. And so really the idea is to keep things separated out, and then if you need to reference another essentially subtree within your application, you basically can reference it via IDs and then use combine reducer to pull those together, which we'll see in just a little bit. But you only ever have one store in your application, but then you want to separate those out into essentially, or access them via reducers. Any more questions? Cool. So this is essentially the schema for the most part for the entire App Store as it is, which is our kind of global. It just identifies the schema for our single state tree. So back into the slides. This is what this looks like if I'd only waited. And so now I have the App Store, then I have the interface item. So I just think with TypeScript, it's really nice to create interfaces so that you can program to them.